Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this weekend's edition of Book Bites. Throughout the last few months, I've been celebrating the resurgence of memoir. I found that there's been an impetus, a greater impetus perhaps, of more memoir being written, more family stories, more biographies, more autobiographies. This evening, I don't have an author guest as such, because the author of this book passed away in 2019, just before she had completed the book, and the completion of the book was then taken on by Professor Susanne Klaussen, who's a senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg. And obviously, the publishers at Jacana saw fit to bring this important memoir to light. It is called Freedom Writer by the late Juby Mayet, who was an extremely well-known journalist of her time. I found it a very instructive and a very very powerful memoir. And I think reading a memoir, knowing that the author didn't get to see its completion after all of the work that she put in. Juby Mayet was 82 when she passed away in April 2019, and the book has just been launched this year. Gives you a different sense of perspective about how we plan and what life has in store, and also gives a certain amount of greater impetus to why memoir is so significant, so important to document life histories, the likes of people of the caliber of the late Juby Mayet. She was born in Fietas, Johannesburg in 1937. She began writing at a young age, working first at Golden City Post, moving to Drum, and joining The Voice in 1977. Juby was a founding member of the Union of Black Journalists and a member of the Writers Association of South Africa. She was detained in 1979, and following that detention was served with a 5-year banning order. Her career spanned 5 decades, and although not always working as a journalist, she worked as a cleaner and a secretary. She cleared the path for Black women journalists and inspiring generations of South African journalists and writers throughout the decades that followed. The afterword to round up the research on the book was written by Professor Klaussen. She's the Julia Greg Brof Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Pennsylvania State University, and as I said, Senior Research Associate in the Department of History at the University of Johannesburg. Senior journalist Ferial Haffiji says, "What a woman, what a story, what a journalist. I would have loved to be her. A journalism giant tells her own story." And indeed, as I was reading this book over the weekend, she calls herself and was called Freedom Writer in the book and by her colleagues. And it's a fascinating account of being a journalist in the 70s and 80s at the height of apartheid, being a Black woman journalist from a community that might have thought it's not exactly the safest to go out there, but also, with the oppressive structures of the state at the time, and having to challenge those structures comes through very strongly in the way it's written. I also appreciate how the author writes in a very anecdotal way. And I think that's the power of memoir. The power of memoir is really about reaching back into the past and unpacking, perhaps opening your deck of cards, because that's really what memoir is. And playing that as an open hand and saying, well, these were the good times, these were the traumas, these were the tragedies, these were the bad times. And the good, the bad, and the ugly is then laid bare for all to see, because it really is about taking that authentic journey within oneself and writing it. And this autobiographer, achieves that in telling her tale, even if she, didn't get to see its completion. The late great Juby Mayet, at the age of 82 when she passed away, had a legacy behind her of the New Age, Drum, Golden City Post, The Voice. Some of the greatest publications of an era were elevated by Juby's voice. Her happy, jazz-inflected writing is thrilling, and all the more so in this memoir. Mayet was a writer and a fighter, a freedom fighter, for whom media freedom was sacred, and being a writer was the greatest thing a person could do. She really saw her writing as a form of activism. She had voice. She never denied herself the power to speak. And I think she'd passed this onward to each of her children as well. She faced tragedy through her loved ones as well. losing a husband at an early age in a car crash, losing three of her children in the late 90s, being incarcerated herself, with detained without trial, and also I think the huge blow to her career was this banning order. And under the apartheid laws of the 50s, 1950, she was not allowed, or any form of media was not allowed to report her voice or her sort of word in print on a public platform for fear of being banned. And so those kinds of banning orders did sort of both kill her career, but also challenged a person who was very much about putting her voice out there. And I think that Professor Claussen's afterword is an essential and an elegant contribution to Juby's life and times. And in her own words, an urgent call for Juby Mayet to receive the recognition she so deserves. And I think our generations who didn't get to encounter her writing directly, is richer for having this memoir in our hands. It's just being launched currently, richer for being able to, you know, carry this message onward. And I hope that memoirs of this nature will encourage more of our elders, more of our contributors to our social history, to write their own stories, whether you're writing for your own family or whether you're writing for a broader audience, hopefully. This documentation is such an important part of creating legacy for us of the future, for our children of the future. In her final chapter, Susanne Klaussen says, remembering Juby Mayet, in her own words, Juby Mayet says, I was never anti anything. People called me names. People said I'm an activist, I'm a freedom fighter, but I'm not. If anything describes me, you can say I was a freedom writer. And so she took her writing very seriously. From 1957 to 1978, Juby Mayet was a reporter, as we said, who worked for numerous culturally significant South African publications: the weekly tabloid Golden City Post, Drug Magazine, True Love Magazine, and the anti-apartheid periodicals UBJ Bulletin, which was the newsletter of the Union for Black Journalists, of which Juby Mayet was a founder, The Voice, Asisudula, The Worker, and Sowetan Sunday Mirror. During these 2 decades, she produced an eclectic body of work, including coverage of political, criminal, social, and community events, feature articles, interviews, opinion pieces, weekly columns offering advice, recipes, fashion tips, and more, short stories, and poetry. In the 1970s, she also became a leading struggle journalist and started to be called the Freedom Writer, the moniker awarded to the courageous reporters who used the typewriter to speak truth to power and suffered the consequences as a result of their outspokenness. In Juby's case, the price paid was nearly 5 months imprisonment without trial in 1978 at the number 4 women's jail at the fort in Johannesburg, and then being banned under sections 9 of 1 and 10(1)A of the Internal Security Act of 1950, that made it illegal for her to appear or speak in public, and for the press to publish or report her words. These acts of reprisal by the apartheid regime caused intense emotional and financial hardship for her and her family, especially as she was widowed and she was responsible for her young children, and ultimately destroyed her career. And I remember when she writes and she talks about in the book about the day when she was picked up by the special branch, and her eldest son is only about 18 or 19 at the time, and he's helping her in the office, just sort of making some photocopies and that sort of thing. And he bursts into tears. And she speaks later about going home to pack things. They allowed her to go home to pack a small bag. And she's not able to see her children who are still at school. Most of them are still at school. The one is studying for his exams at home, and she meets him. So these kinds of things, understanding that you're a mom, you're the only caregiver for these small children, and that you are being taken away and you're not being told how much. Was it a 90-day detention? They did count down to 90 days, but hers was extended, and she ended up spending 5 months locked up. The fact that she, a self-described shy Malay girl from a poor family, had the temerity to pursue her dream to be a writer in the 1950s in South Africa is rather remarkable, says Susanne Klaussen. The fact that she succeeded in forging a career documenting the absurdities and cruelties of apartheid in the male-dominated world of journalism is extraordinary. The fact that she did so as a widow raising 8 children on a black reporter's paycheck is nothing short of incredible. I absolutely agree. When you read the story, your heart is in your throat half of the time because you understand that this was somebody who couldn't say no if anyone needed help while she handled her own struggles, while she dealt with her own grief and her own losses and her own challenges. And her house, her home, as small perhaps it was, also was welcoming to anyone who needed a place to stay, whether they were victims of, a violent household, whether they had come from out of town and they got sort of ditched from a job, they were a job prospective job that they were waiting for. She was a safe house for many, many people that went through her home. And I think also being born in a time when there was struggle throughout the community and strife throughout the community, there was a sense of communal assistance, the sense of altruism, of doing for each other. And she also speaks of a strong family background. She gives a lot of reference to her own siblings who were there for her, a strong mother who was there for her, who sort of gave her that power of the voice, who taught her to stand up for herself and to speak for herself. And I wonder sometimes when I consider our current generation and I consider where we are now and I look back at the stories from the past, can we take a page out of that book and say, well, this tradition, this culture of entitlement can be discarded? Or we're actually losing a significance among ourselves to create that kind of impact on society just because we expect life to happen for us. Instead of going out there and making it happen, going out there and serving humanity, serving our common man, serving our clans and our communities, and actually making a difference. So when I read this book, I feel all the more heartbroken that the author wasn't able to see her story in print, in a print format in a book. But at the same time, I'm grateful that that we can hold something so precious in our hands and be able to read it. She talks of, some of the big names like Ken Themba and Dolly Ratebe and interacting with Ruth First and Joe Slovo. She was an activist, she was a journalist, but she also worked as a legal secretary. And so she met a lot of people who were fighting the system, walking through those doors in various spaces. And then sometimes you think, life is kind of perfectly tailored for you if you take the right steps, if you have the right intentions, and if you move forward with the right sort of with this right vision and the right drivenness to make a difference. And so you find she wrote under the name Susan Davis, taking the name of a music icon, that Sammy Davis Jr. that she enjoyed. And I think that writing with a pseudonym just allowed her to reach beyond what she might have thought were limitations, having a Muslim name, or at the time perhaps having a brown name. And this book is fascinating in how it also, there's at least a good chapter written on, by Susanne Klaussen, rounding up not just the anecdotal references, but giving the history of the time, the legalities, the statutes that weighed down on them, but also her writing life, going through her different journalistic experiences that go beyond what she was talking about in terms of her friends and her family references and what happened in her household and in her family as such. So I think that for a historian like Klaussen to have gone in and sat down and taken the time to speak to her and to document, the kind of people that she interacted with, who became icons of Black cultural production, the writers and photographers like Bob Gosani, Elf Kumalo, Peter Magubane, Arthur Memani, Todd Mashikiza, Blok Modisani, Casey Motsitsi, Zeke Patlele, Net Nakasa, Louis Nkosi, who we've all heard of, Jürgen Schadeberg, and Ken Themba, the highly respected investigative reporter Henry Kumalo, nicknamed Mr. Drum. She says was killed the very month she was hired, but she had that initial interaction. So the gains and losses of the industry at the time, she was she was at the top of that. And until this book, many of us would not have heard much about the shall I say, notorious Juby Mayet slash Davis. And having written this memoir in this direct way that she writes, in this very sort of playful, anecdotal way, in this colloquial way as well, I think makes you feel like you're listening to the author speak directly. Another powerful and important note to be made of memoir is to be able to listen to a person even long after they're gone. Um, for me, speaking to her Black consciousness philosophy was also something important. And some of these notes have been made by the historian Klaussen. She speaks about 6 fundamental truths that according to Juby Mayet, explain why Black consciousness was the philosophy for her. And I'll go through some of the points quickly. It's just 6 fundamental points. She says, I am a human being as good as the next person, whatever his color, with my own sense of value, worth, self-respect, and dignity. The next point, because of the peculiarities of the government body in the country in which I was born and the system under which I have to live, I'm forced to accept that as pertains to race, I'm not white, and equally because I refuse to conceive of myself as a negative being, I'm proud to be Black, to call myself Black, and to be known to be Black. And a quick note, there's a point where her family moves to Lenasia, and her husband is classified as Indian or Asiatic under the code, the apartheid code, and they're not questioned about their choice of being able to live here. As soon as he passes away in a car crash, which is sudden, um, the state suddenly raises the department raises the issue of her being so-called sort of labeled under the colored, and her children being half Indian or Indian, and so she's not allowed to live in Lenasia. She has to go through the painful re-identification process, reclassification process of being Asiatic in order to remain in the same suburb, in the same ghetto, and in the same house as her own children, her own blood children. So that discarding of identity, that forced discarding of identity, that was part of the absurdity of the apartheid code. Point 3, from the little I know about my ancestors, she says they were brought here as slaves some 200 or 300 years ago, and the fact that I am here proves to me at any rate that none of them went or perhaps even wished to go back to Java or wherever they came from. I therefore regard myself as much a Black citizen of this land as any other Black, and unlike Alex Haley, I have no wish to trace back my roots. My roots are right in the soil of Africa, and I am prepared to die in the struggle to liberate my country and my people. And by my people, I mean all Black citizens who are oppressed by the white racist regime. Point number 4, Black consciousness to me is walking tall, standing up for my rights as a human being, in spite of the fact that I am Black and not just because I am Black. Racism is not part of my nature, she says as a 5th point, but I have become largely anti-white because of the system in this country. I do have a few, 1 or 2 white friends, but on the whole, I'm of the opinion, and it says the text was undecipherable. I think this was written in her original script and was now transcribed for this chapter. Although I would venture to state that Black consciousness isn't a racist philosophy, I would add that Black consciousness is a state of mind, and a beautiful state of mind if you are lucky enough to have it or to be able to acquire it. I think I have it. And her final point, an important facet of BC, is your duty towards other Black people who are still in a fog of uncertainty about their worth of human beings, who are still shackled to their sense of inferiority or even worthless because of the constant brainwashing, the heavy oppressive measures that govern their lives, their lack of education, their poverty, and their restrictive freedom of movement and their limited job opportunities. As a BC protagonist, you must, wherever opportunity arises, talk to people in ways calculated to politicize and conscientize them and to help lift them out of their morass of self-demigration that imprisons them. And I think it's important to have heard these points, especially as the author is no longer with us, to know that this is an ideology that out of a sense of moral consciousness one can apply, even if you don't have it, didn't really put word to it, have the terminology for it. Here's what she subscribes to Black consciousness in her own life, or subscribe, and how it informed her writing, her way of thinking, and how she presented herself. And so finally, as a tribute, the historian says Juby died of pancreatic cancer at her home in Lenasia, surrounded by family, on 13 April 2019. She left before I was able to ask questions about important events, people, opinions, impressions, and memories, but her personal papers, insights from those who knew her, and most importantly, her published and unpublished writing enable us to understand a great deal about her life and times. These sources are invaluable supplements to what she shares in her autobiography. She has occasionally been remembered and honored over the years for fearless anti-apartheid reporting and activism. After South Africa's transition to liberal democracy in 94, she was profiled in books about female imprisonment and Muslims' role in the fight against apartheid, invited to the TRC to give testimony to not one but two special hearings, and received awards for her role in the struggle for democracy by various women's journalistic and political foundations. For example, in 2013, she was awarded the Steve Biko International Peace Award by the Steve Biko Foundation, presented to her by Nonsikelelo Biko, whom Juby had interviewed after Biko was killed. I think it's important, sincerely and significantly important, that we have this, and I hope that many of you will be picking up copies of this book. I think this book adds significantly to our all the contributions on understanding what apartheid was like from the first-hand journalists, activists who experienced it. And as I said, it's an important historical and significant social document of that time. But to have heard it firsthand before we lost a significant voice, I think is something to celebrate. I know that many of you will be picking up copies. I think this should be on the bookshelf of anyone who has a significant sort of respect for those who brought us through the struggle. But also when we understand what troubled times we're going through right now as a country, the economic apartheid faced by many millions of our people, and the struggle as we see significant forms of infrastructure all but collapsing around us. Let us understand that the struggle is not over, that our need to speak up, speak truth to power, is now more relevant than ever. And that's it from me this weekend on BookBytes. Inshallah, we'll return with another fascinating book next weekend. And fi amanillah, happy reading to one and all as we get through the weeks leading us up to Ramadan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.